I watched my sister slip her hand into mine, smile at me, and then spend the rest of the evening stealing the man I thought loved me. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I simply stood there in my own living room and realized that some betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people who know exactly where your heart is most vulnerable. My name is Diane Parker. I'm 68 years old, and the night everything changed was supposed to be one of the happiest nights I'd had in years. The party had taken me nearly 3 weeks to plan. After losing my husband a decade earlier, I never imagined I would find companionship again. Then Robert Sullivan came into my life. He was kind, attentive, and patient. At 71, he made me feel seen again. Not young, not glamorous, just seen. For the first time in years, I felt like I had something to celebrate. So I invited my family and closest friends to my home outside Columbus, Ohio. I decorated the backyard with string lights. Fresh flowers lined the tables. The catering trays arrived right on schedule. The weather was perfect, 74 degrees with a soft summer breeze. Everything felt right. When guests began arriving, I greeted each one with a smile. My sister Judith showed up 20 minutes late, exactly as she always did. At 72, she still carried herself with the confidence of someone who expected every room to belong to her. She hugged me tightly and handed me a bottle of wine. "You look wonderful tonight," she said. I thanked her and thought nothing of it. Looking back, maybe I should have. The evening moved along beautifully. Friends laughed. Music played softly through outdoor speakers. Robert stayed close to me for most of the night. More than once, someone joked that we looked like newlyweds. I remember feeling embarrassed and happy at the same time. Then small things started happening. Judith interrupted conversations whenever Robert and I were talking. She laughed a little too hard at his jokes. She touched his arm whenever she spoke to him. Nothing obvious. Nothing anyone else would notice. But enough to make me uncomfortable. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, she was my sister. As the sun disappeared and the backyard lights began to glow against the darkness, I went inside to bring out a dessert tray. I was gone less than 2 minutes. When I stepped back onto the patio, I noticed Robert was missing. Judith was missing too. A strange feeling settled into my stomach. I set down the tray and quietly walked toward the side garden beside the house. That was when I saw them standing together beneath the maple tree. Judith was smiling. Robert was smiling back. And in that moment, I understood that the evening I had worked so hard to create was no longer my celebration. It had become the beginning of a betrayal neither of them thought I would survive. I smiled, turned around, and walked away. They thought they had won. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The house was quiet except for the steady hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of birds outside my kitchen window. For a few seconds, I lay still, staring at the ceiling, hoping the previous night had been some strange misunderstanding. Then I remembered the look on Judith's face beneath the maple tree. The smile, the confidence, the certainty that she had done nothing wrong. I slowly got out of bed and made coffee. The familiar routine helped steady my hands. The coffee maker gurgled softly while pale morning light spilled across the countertops. Everything looked normal. That was the hardest part. The world had not changed, yet somehow my entire life felt different. I carried my mug to the back porch and sat in the same chair where Robert and I had shared countless conversations over the past year. We had talked about retirement, family, travel, and all the ordinary things people discuss when they believe they have found someone trustworthy. Now the empty chair across from me seemed to mock my memories. By 8 o'clock, my phone remained silent. No message from Robert. No apology. No explanation. I told myself that silence was an answer too. Around mid-morning, I opened social media. Within seconds, I wished I had not. There was Judith, smiling in a photo taken at a downtown cafe. Across from her sat Robert. The picture had been posted less than an hour earlier. The caption read, "Wonderful morning with wonderful company." Hundreds of people would see that photo and think nothing of it. They would not know what had happened the night before. They would not know that my own sister had chosen to cross a line she could never uncross. I set my phone down and stared out the window. What surprised me most was not the sadness. It was the familiarity. This feeling had visited me before. Not because of Robert. Because of Judith. Growing up, she always seemed to step into spaces that belonged to someone else. If I made a friend, Judith somehow became closer to them. If I achieved something, she found a way to make the attention shift back to herself. For years, I convinced myself that it was harmless. Sisters compete. Sisters argue. Sisters move on. That was the story I told myself. But sitting alone in my kitchen that morning, I began replaying decades of memories with new eyes. A pattern emerged. One disappointment after another. One small betrayal after another. Robert was not the beginning. He was simply the first time I had finally stopped making excuses. As the afternoon sun moved across the hardwood floor, I realized something important. Judith had taken many things from me over the years. But this time, I was going to learn exactly why. For the next several days, I found myself looking backward far more than forward. It was as if my mind had opened an old attic door and dust-covered memories were suddenly spilling into the light. I began remembering things I had not thought about in years. When Judith and I were children, she always seemed to know how to become the center of attention without appearing to try. At family gatherings, relatives praised her confidence while complimenting me for being quiet and helpful. At the time, I accepted those roles. Judith was the bright star. I was the dependable one. It seemed harmless then. But as I sat alone in my living room one evening, watching the sun sink behind the trees outside my window, I started connecting moments that had once seemed unrelated. When I was 17, I had been accepted into a summer arts program in Chicago. I had worked hard for that opportunity. A week before I was supposed to leave, Judith somehow convinced our parents that she should attend a different program that required financial support. There was not enough money for both of us. My plans disappeared. Everyone said it was unfortunate timing. I believed them. Years later, when I became engaged to my first serious boyfriend, Judith suddenly became very interested in spending time with both of us. The engagement ended before the wedding ever happened. I never fully understood why. Looking back, I remembered countless private conversations, subtle comments, and moments that left me feeling uncertain about myself. At the time, I blamed my own insecurities. Now I was not so sure. The more memories surfaced, the clearer the pattern became. Judith did not always take things directly. Sometimes she simply positioned herself where attention, affection, or opportunity naturally drifted in her direction. She rarely appeared responsible. Other people made excuses for her, including me. That realization hurt more than I expected, not because of what she had done, but because of how long I had ignored it. One afternoon, while sorting through old family photographs stored in a hallway closet, I came across a picture taken nearly 30 years earlier. Judith stood in the center, surrounded by relatives. I was off to one side holding a tray of food. Everyone was smiling. At first glance, it looked like a happy family memory. Yet something about it stopped me. That photograph captured our entire relationship in a single frame. Judith receiving attention, me making sure everyone else was comfortable. I stared at the image for a long time before placing it back in the box. Later that evening, my phone buzzed. A mutual friend had commented on another photo Judith posted with Robert. They looked comfortable together. Familiar. As though this new version of their relationship had not begun recently. Instead of feeling angry, I felt curious. Very curious. Because for the first time, I stopped asking why Judith behaved this way. I started asking a different question. How long had this really been happening behind my back? The question stayed with me for days. How long had this been happening behind my back? The answer did not arrive all at once. Instead, it appeared in small pieces, like scattered puzzle fragments finally finding their place. The following Tuesday, I drove into town to return a book to the public library. It was an ordinary errand, the kind of task that usually helped clear my mind. As I stepped out of my car, I heard someone call my name. It was Carol Whitman. Carol and I had been friends for nearly 20 years. She was the kind of person who noticed details other people overlooked. We exchanged hugs and spent a few minutes talking about ordinary things. The weather, her grandchildren, a community fundraiser scheduled for the following month. Then something changed in her expression. She hesitated. For a brief moment, she seemed unsure whether to continue. I immediately recognized that look. It was the look people wear when they know something uncomfortable. "Diane," she said carefully, "there is something I have been debating whether to tell you." My stomach tightened. We walked to a quiet bench near the library entrance and sat down. Carol folded her hands in her lap and stared at the sidewalk before speaking again. "I assumed you already knew," she said. "That is why I never mentioned it." A cold feeling settled over me. "Mentioned what?" I asked. Carol took a slow breath. "I have seen Judith and Robert together several times over the past few months." For a second, I thought I had misunderstood her. Several times. Not once. Not recently. Several times. She quickly explained that she had noticed them having coffee together on different occasions. Once at a restaurant near the river, another time at a bookstore downtown. She said nothing about inappropriate behavior. Nothing dramatic. What bothered her was how familiar they seemed. Comfortable. Relaxed. Like people who had established routines together. I honestly thought you knew, she repeated. I thought maybe the three of you were friends. I nodded slowly while keeping my face calm. Inside, however, every memory from the previous year was rearranging itself. Robert occasionally canceling plans at the last minute. Judith suddenly knowing details about conversations I had only shared with him. The strange feeling I experienced whenever they happened to arrive at family gatherings within minutes of each other. I had ignored those moments because I trusted both of them. Trust can be comforting. It can also be blinding. Carol reached over and squeezed my hand. I am sorry, she said softly. I never wanted to hurt you. I thanked her and assured her she had done nothing wrong. On the drive home, I barely turned on the radio. My mind was too busy connecting pieces. By the time I pulled into my driveway, one thing had become painfully clear. The evening of my party had not been the beginning of anything. It had simply been the first time their carefully hidden story stepped into the light where I could finally see it. After my conversation with Carol, I stopped looking at the situation as a wounded woman and started looking at it as someone searching for the truth. Emotions can cloud judgment, but facts rarely do. Over the next week, I paid attention to details I would have ignored before. I did not call Robert. I did not contact Judith. Their silence told me enough. If either of them felt regret, they had an odd way of showing it. Instead, social media became their stage. New photographs appeared every few days. Lunches, walks through local parks, smiling faces framed by carefully chosen captions. It all seemed designed to tell the world a story. The story of two people who had suddenly found happiness. Yet something about it felt forced. One evening, while browsing online, I noticed a comment from someone I did not recognize. The woman congratulated Robert on what she called his fresh start after a difficult financial year. The phrase caught my attention immediately. Financial year. Robert had always presented himself as comfortable and secure. Not wealthy, but stable. During our relationship, he often spoke about investments, retirement plans, and future travel. He seemed confident whenever money came up. Still, that comment stayed in my mind. The following morning, I met Carol for coffee. During our conversation, I casually asked whether she knew anything about Robert's work history. Carol hesitated before answering. I thought everyone knew, she said. Apparently, I did not. She explained that Robert had sold part of his business several years earlier after a series of setbacks. According to local rumors, he had spent much of the past 2 years trying to rebuild his finances. Nothing scandalous. Nothing criminal. Just a man facing financial pressure. As I stirred my coffee, another memory surfaced. Judith had inherited a significant amount of money from her late husband 3 years earlier. She owned her home outright. She had investment accounts. She often spoke about financial security. Suddenly, a possibility appeared that I could not ignore. What if this situation was not simply about romance? What if other motivations existed beneath the surface? I drove home thinking about that question. The more I considered it, the more uneasy I became. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I hoped they would fail, but because I realized I might never have truly known Robert at all. That evening, I opened an old notebook where I occasionally wrote personal reflections. I began listing dates, conversations, and moments that now seemed important. The notebook slowly filled with observations, patterns, questions, unanswered details. By the time midnight arrived, several pages were covered in neat handwriting. I closed the notebook and placed it beside my bed. For the first time since my party, I felt something stronger than sadness. I felt determination. Because whatever story Judith and Robert were presenting to the world, I had a growing suspicion that the real story had not yet been told. 3 days later, an unexpected phone call pushed the story in a direction I never anticipated. I was trimming roses in my backyard when my cell phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something told me to answer. The voice on the other end belonged to Michael Turner, an attorney I vaguely recognized from a community charity board years earlier. After introducing himself, he asked whether I had a few minutes to talk. There was something careful about his tone. Professional, but cautious. I set down my gardening gloves and walked onto the porch. Michael explained that he had represented several local business owners over the years, including Robert during a difficult period following the sale of part of his company. He stressed that he could not discuss confidential legal matters. However, he felt compelled to share information that was already part of the public record and easily accessible. What he told me was not shocking because it was scandalous. It was shocking because it revealed how little I had actually known. Over the past few years, Robert had faced a series of financial setbacks. Investments had underperformed. Business partnerships had dissolved. Several projects he expected to generate income never developed as planned. None of it suggested dishonesty. None of it suggested criminal behavior. It simply painted the picture of a man working very hard to maintain an appearance of stability while privately struggling with uncertainty. After the call ended, I sat quietly on my porch swing for nearly an hour. The afternoon sun drifted across the yard while I replayed countless conversations in my mind. Robert had always spoken confidently about future plans, weekend trips, retirement travel, real estate opportunities. Looking back, many of those conversations now sounded less like certainty and more like hope. Hope presented as confidence. That realization alone did not bother me. Everyone faces challenges. What troubled me was something else. Why had he hidden so much? Later that evening, I opened my notebook again. The list of questions continued growing. Besides several entries, I wrote one word in capital letters. Timing. The timing of his growing closeness to Judith. The timing of her inheritance. The timing of his increasing distance from me. The timing of everything. The next morning, another detail surfaced unexpectedly. Carol called and mentioned that Judith had recently begun discussing major renovations to her home. Expensive renovations. New landscaping. Interior remodeling. Upgrades that would cost a considerable amount of money. According to Carol, Judith seemed unusually optimistic about the future. I thanked her for the information and ended the call. Then I sat at my kitchen table staring at nothing. For weeks, I had been trying to understand what happened. Now I realized I had been asking the wrong question. The question was no longer whether Robert and Judith had betrayed my trust. That answer was obvious. The real question was whether they fully understood each other at all. Because the more facts I uncovered, the more I began to suspect that each of them believed they were gaining something valuable. And sometimes the most dangerous situations begin when two people are chasing different dreams while pretending they want the same thing. About 2 weeks later, the invitation arrived. It came in a cream-colored envelope with elegant lettering on the front. Judith had always appreciated appearances. Even as children, she believed presentation could change reality. Inside was an invitation to a celebration at a country club outside Columbus. Judith and Robert were hosting what they described as a special evening with family and friends. The wording was carefully chosen. Warm, optimistic, forward-looking. I read the card twice before setting it on my kitchen table. Then I laughed quietly to myself. Not because it was funny, because it was predictable. They wanted an audience. They wanted witnesses. More importantly, they wanted everyone to see that they had moved forward while I had supposedly been left behind. A few days later, Carol called after receiving her own invitation. "Are you going?" she asked. I looked out the window at the garden and took a sip of tea before answering. "Yes," I said calmly. "I think I am." There was a brief silence. "Are you sure?" she asked. Completely. The truth was that something inside me had changed during the previous month. In the beginning, I wanted explanations. Then I wanted answers. Now I simply wanted clarity. Not for them. For myself. The evening of the event arrived with clear skies and mild temperatures. I chose a navy blue dress that had been hanging in my closet for years. Simple, elegant, comfortable. I spent extra time arranging my silver hair and putting on a pair of pearl earrings that once belonged to my mother. Looking into the mirror, I felt surprisingly calm. The woman staring back at me no longer looked wounded. She looked observant. When I arrived at the country club parking lot, expensive cars lined the entrance. Through the windows, I could see people mingling beneath chandeliers and soft lighting. Laughter drifted through the evening air. Everything looked polished. Perfect. Almost too perfect. As soon as I entered the ballroom, conversation slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. Heads turned. Eyes followed me. Judith noticed me first. Her smile froze for half a second before returning. Robert looked equally surprised. I realized they had expected me to decline the invitation. Instead, I walked directly toward them. "You both look wonderful," I said warmly. Judith blinked. Robert forced a smile. We exchanged a few polite words before I moved into the crowd. Throughout the evening, I watched. I listened. People revealed far more than they intended when they believed everything was going according to plan. Several guests congratulated Judith on her future. Others spoke about Robert's exciting new chapter. Yet beneath the compliments, I noticed small inconsistencies. Questions left unanswered. Stories that changed slightly depending on who was speaking. By the time dessert was served, I felt more certain than ever. The image they were presenting to the world was carefully constructed. And like most carefully constructed things, it was beginning to show cracks. As the evening continued, I found myself standing near one of the ballroom windows, watching reflections move across the glass. Conversations floated through the room in fragments. Laughter, compliments, predictions about the future. Yet beneath the surface, something felt increasingly fragile. Around 9 o'clock, I stepped outside onto the terrace for fresh air. The night was cool and quiet compared to the noise inside. I was not alone for long. Robert joined me a few minutes later. For the first time in weeks, we found ourselves face to face without an audience. He offered a polite smile. "I am glad you came," he said. I studied him carefully. There was confidence in his voice, but not as much as before. "Are you?" I asked gently. He looked away toward the golf course stretching beyond the terrace lights. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he surprised me. "You probably think you know everything," he said. "Actually," I replied, "I think I know very little." That answer seemed to unsettle him. He shifted uncomfortably before explaining that life had been complicated recently. Plans had changed. Circumstances had changed. People had changed. The explanation sounded rehearsed, as though he had repeated it many times in his own mind. I listened quietly. When he finished, I simply nodded. "I hope you find what you were looking for," I said. His expression tightened slightly. Before he could respond, the terrace door opened again. Judith appeared carrying 2 glasses of champagne. Her smile faded the moment she saw us together. The reaction lasted only an instant, but it was enough. Something about it caught my attention. It was not jealousy. It was concern, almost as if she feared a conversation she could not control. The 3 of us exchanged a few awkward words before returning inside. Back in the ballroom, I continued observing. Throughout the rest of the evening, I noticed small details that others overlooked. Judith repeatedly redirected conversations whenever financial topics emerged. Robert became noticeably quiet whenever future plans were discussed in detail. Several guests asked questions about travel, retirement, and property investments. Their answers remained vague, not dishonest, just incomplete. Near the end of the celebration, I overheard 2 guests discussing a business opportunity Robert had recently declined. One of them seemed surprised. "I thought he needed the income," the man said casually. The other quickly changed the subject after noticing me nearby. The comment lasted only a few seconds, but it echoed in my thoughts. By the time I left the country club, the evening had confirmed something important. Neither Judith nor Robert appeared completely comfortable. They were presenting certainty to the world, but certainty was not what I saw. I saw tension. I saw unanswered questions. And as I drove home beneath the dark Ohio sky, I realized the truth was getting closer. Not because I was searching harder, because the people hiding it were beginning to reveal it themselves. The weeks that followed brought a kind of clarity I had not experienced in years. Not because dramatic secrets suddenly appeared. Not because someone confessed. The truth revealed itself through ordinary life. One morning, Carol called and invited me to breakfast. As we sat in a small diner near the edge of town, she shared something she had recently heard from mutual friends. Judith and Robert had begun arguing more frequently. Nothing public, nothing outrageous. Just the kind of tension that develops when expectations collide with reality. I listened quietly and stirred my coffee. Strangely, I felt no satisfaction. Months earlier, I probably would have. Now I simply felt tired. Tired of competition. Tired of comparison. Tired of measuring my worth against someone else's choices. A few days later, I received an unexpected message from Robert. It was short, respectful. He asked if we could meet and talk. After considering it for a day, I agreed. We met at a public park on a cool autumn afternoon. Leaves covered the walking paths in shades of gold and red. Robert looked older than I remembered. Not physically, emotionally. We walked slowly beside the lake, while speaking about ordinary things at first. Eventually, the conversation turned toward the past. He admitted that he had handled many situations poorly. He admitted that he should have been more honest. Yet what struck me most was what he did not say. He never described finding happiness. He never described certainty about the future. Instead, he spoke about confusion, regret, pressure, choices made without fully understanding their consequences. When he finished, I simply nodded. I did not need an apology anymore. I did not need explanations. Most importantly, I did not need him to validate my pain. Before we parted ways, he looked at me and asked a question. "Do you hate me?" I smiled gently. "No," I answered. "I think I finally understand you." As I walked back to my car, I realized those words were true. Understanding did not erase what happened, but it freed me from carrying it. Several months later, I heard that Judith and Robert were no longer spending as much time together. The details did not matter to me. Their story belonged to them. Mine belonged to me. On a quiet Sunday afternoon, I sat in my backyard surrounded by blooming flowers and the familiar sounds of birds moving through the trees. The same backyard where I had once celebrated, hoped, trusted, and eventually been disappointed. Yet the place felt different now because I was different. For most of my life, I believed I was competing with my sister for attention, approval, affection, and importance. I finally understood that the competition had existed only because I agreed to participate in it. The moment I stopped comparing my life to hers, the contest ended. I never got back the relationship I thought I had. I never got back the trust that was broken. What I gained was something far more valuable: peace. And for the first time in decades, I chose myself without guilt. Sitting there beneath the afternoon sun, I realized that was the real victory all along.